Story 1. Idi Amin lived the rest of his life in luxury in Saudi Arabia, while Pol Pot spent his final years moldering in a jungle. Story 2. A Japanese doctor drowned Chinese prisoners to calculate how much seawater a person can ingest before dying. He was granted immunity in exchange for his research. Story 3. Pol Pot led the Cambodian genocide and died of natural causes decades after his regime killed millions of Cambodians over a few years. Story 4. Indonesian President Suharto was responsible for two genocides, one in his own country in 1965 and another in East Timor from 1975 to 1999. He was one of the most corrupt leaders of all time and led an authoritarian nationalist regime. A protest movement sparked by the Asian financial crisis forced him to resign, but he was never punished and died a very wealthy man. His family remains wealthy and respected, and his former son-in-law is the current president. I just realized I am writing this on September 30th, the anniversary of the failed coup attempt that led to Suharto's rise to power and the subsequent genocide. Read The Jakarta Method. It is an excellent book that discusses these events. Story 5. Jimmy Savile's crimes were not revealed until after his death. He was celebrated as a national treasure, given a knighthood by the Queen, and viewed as a great character, slightly inappropriate at times but ultimately harmless. In reality, he was hiding in plain sight. The things he was able to get away with while winking at the camera are haunting. Story 6. Joseph Mengele was known as the Angel of Death at Auschwitz. He died while swimming off the coast of Sao Paulo in 1979, 34 years after World War II. Story 7. King Leopold II of Belgium presided over the Congo. Millions died under his rule, and he faced almost no real consequences. Story 8. Warren Anderson caused thousands of deaths through his careless and harmful management of the Union Carbide factory in India. Thousands more were born with disabilities after the Bhopal gas disaster. Story 9. The Sackler family sold opioid addiction to the country that trusted them and made them rich. Instead of answering for their crimes, they have become anonymous and hide among us. They made $20 billion and were forced to pay $5 billion in restitution, and can never be sued again. If that is not scot-free, I do not know what is. I will be waiting for them in hell. I am patient. Story 10. Perpetrators of Unit 731 were spared so the United States could obtain their research. Close to 500,000 people were killed and subjected to biological experiments. Story 11. Robert H. Richards IV is a billionaire heir to the DuPont family who raped his 3-year-old daughter. Not only does he come from a family that poisoned the world with per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, problems we continue to face today, but he also received no prison time because, and I quote, "The defendant will not fare well in prison. Rules are only for the poor. Billionaires are above the law. See the Epstein fiasco. We do not have a justice system, we have a legal system." Story 12. The perpetrators who tortured, raped, and killed Junko Furuta are all out of prison. Story 13. Issei Sagawa was a Japanese student who killed, cooked, and ate a fellow student in Paris in June 1981. His parents were wealthy. He returned to Japan and became a celebrity. Story 14. After World War II, American officials decided Issei's research was too valuable for him to be prosecuted. Other Japanese military leaders could not stomach watching footage of the atrocities committed at Unit 731, which Issei directed. Story 15. Genghis Khan caused immense devastation across Eurasia, yet he is often venerated by historians and ordinary people alike, including the descendants of those he subjugated. Story 16. Henry Kissinger. Despite the alleged atrocities, he seemed to have had a relatively calm life and died at the age of 100. That fits my definition of scot-free. Story 17. Genghis Khan fell off his horse at about age 65 and died shortly after. He was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 20 to 40 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population. He ordered the slaughter of entire civilian populations, including women, children, infants, and the elderly, to instill systematic terror and deter resistance. Story 18. Joshua Blahi, also known as General But Naked, reportedly killed 10,000 people and practiced cannibalism during the Liberian Civil War. He is now a preacher. Story 19. Benjamin Tillman was governor of South Carolina from 1890 to 1894 and a United States senator from 1895 to 1918. He was one of the most racist government officials in United States history. He was an active member of the Red Shirts, a terrorist group during Reconstruction that murdered, intimidated, and beat black people attempting to vote. He bragged about stuffing ballot boxes to win elections, took part in lynchings, helped stage local coups in his home state and in North Carolina, and was one of the key Southerners responsible for disenfranchising black people and preventing anti-lynching legislation from passing when it was needed most. He currently has a hall named after him at Clemson University. Story 20. Mengele conducted atrocious, barbaric experiments on Jews at Auschwitz. He fled to Brazil, started a family, and died of a stroke in 1979. Story 21. Pol Pot was probably the most evil dictator in history. He slipped away into the jungle and died peacefully. Story 22. The first person who comes to mind is Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. He was a member of the Nazi Party Schutzstaffel stationed at Auschwitz and was responsible for selecting who would be killed in the gas chambers and for conducting human experimentation on Jewish prisoners. It was some of the most disgusting and grotesque conduct imaginable. After the war ended, he fled to Argentina and lived the rest of his life scot-free, later dying on a beach in Brazil of old age. I have heard he kidnapped Argentinian and Brazilian people and experimented on them as well. He was utterly evil and never faced justice for his crimes. Story 23. King Leopold II of Belgium turned the Congo into his personal money machine, caused millions of deaths, and still managed to die peacefully in bed while his legacy was whitewashed for decades. Story 24. Leopold II of Belgium was responsible for millions of deaths in the Congo Free State through forced labor, brutality, and exploitation. He was never held accountable. He died wealthy and was celebrated by many in Belgium. Story 25. In Chile, Pinochet backed coups, ran death squads, and murdered thousands. Yet he retired peacefully, avoided real punishment, and even received medical treatment abroad as if nothing had happened. Story 26. All the groomers in the world who died without their reputations being properly tarnished for their hidden deeds. Story 27. Henry Kissinger lived a long life but denied that right to many people around the world. Story 28. King Leopold of Belgium killed over 20 million Africans. That is a scale I have never heard of. Story 29. Andrew Wakefield. How many people have died, and how many will die in the future because of his anti-vaccine quackery? Story 30. Joseph Stalin. I'm surprised he is not a top answer. He was responsible for an estimated 20 million deaths, including mass famines, deportations to gulags, and executions. He invaded Poland in 1939 and occupied several Eastern and Central European countries after the war. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Story 31. Shiro Ishii, if I remember his name correctly, led Unit 731 of Japan during the Second World War. If you do not know what it was, there is a video on YouTube explaining it. Do not watch if you are sensitive to graphic content. Story 32. From the Philippines, probably the last president of our administration. Story 33. One could argue that this refers to Hitler. He committed suicide, which prevented him from being held accountable for his actions. Story 34. Mao Zedong's policies caused a famine that killed between 15 to 55 million people. According to unofficial reports, people even committed cannibalism. Winston Churchill's policies caused the deaths of more than 3 million Indians. Churchill was quoted as saying the famine was caused because Indians were breeding like rabbits. Story 35. Joseph Mengele died in Brazil at nearly 70 and was never arrested or tried for his crimes against humanity. Story 36. King Leopold II died in his palace at the ripe old age of 72 after brutally and systematically exploiting the people of the Congo Free State. Story 37. Definitely for me, Jimmy Savile. We will never know the true scale of his crimes. I heard recently he may have been in cahoots with Peter Sutcliffe and knew the Moors murderers. Also Fred West and Harold Shipman, who took the coward's way out. Story 38. The Japanese imperial family after World War II escaped punishment despite involvement in many wartime atrocities, including the Nanjing Massacre, which was led by Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, who was granted immunity. To give an idea, more people died each month under Japanese occupation than died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. About 200,000 people died in those two attacks, while the average monthly deaths under Imperial Japan were higher, around 250,000. Story 39. King Leopold, hands down. A surprising number of evil people get off scot-free for their crimes, but he stands out to me. More recently, there was a woman who told families that their newborn had died in childbirth and then sold the babies to the highest bidder, who was often a sexual predator. Her crimes were not discovered until after her death. Her name was Georgia Tan. Also, the entire Sackler family. Story 40. Many Nazi scientists were given safe entry into the United States through Operation Paperclip. Wernher von Braun, in particular, is notable. Much of Huntsville, Alabama, is named after him. Story 41. Leopold II of Belgium. Millions died in the Congo Free State while he lived like royalty until his death. Story 42. Many high-level members of the National Socialist German Workers' Party escaped to South America and avoided capture. Story 43. Mao, Stalin, Genghis Khan, Pol Pot, and King Leopold II all died in their beds. Leopold II's funeral was booed. Hitler went out on his own terms. Trump lives in the White House. Netanyahu appears to be doing fine. Take your pick. A better question would be, who is the most evil person in history who actually paid for their crimes? I would say Muammar Gaddafi, who was dragged out of a culvert and executed on video while begging my people for mercy. Mussolini is a close second. Maybe Saddam Hussein is third. Story 44. Surgeon General Shiro Ishii ran Unit 731 in China during World War II, where he conducted horrifying human experiments, atrocities, and chemical warfare tests on the local Chinese population. He was ultimately never prosecuted because he agreed to a deal with the United States to share all the data and medical knowledge he had gathered during that period. Story 45. Hitler killed himself on his own terms. He avoided being captured. Story 46. Henry Kissinger promoted coups throughout Latin America, resulting in thousands of deaths and billions of dollars in debt that contributed to long-term poverty for millions. He received the Nobel Peace Prize and died wealthy at an advanced age. Story 47. To call Joseph Mengele evil is a gross understatement. He was never held accountable in this life, but hopefully he was made to pay on the other side. Story 48. The woman who lied about Emmett Till died an old woman. Story 49. Richard Sackler of Purdue Pharma caused thousands of deaths and destroyed many families. Story 50. Leopold II of Belgium. Story 51. Joseph Mengele has to be high on the list. Joseph Stalin as well. There is a pattern forming. Story 52. King Leopold II of Belgium turned the Congo into his personal money machine in the late 1800s, and millions of people died as a result. He became extremely wealthy and lived comfortably, and when he was finally exposed, he evaded punishment. Story 53. The way Winston Churchill handled the Indian famine during World War II was nothing short of genocidal negligence, a blatant arrogance by a man who saw the Indian population as disposable. He tried to justify his actions, but in reality there is no excuse. Do I like Churchill? He is certainly complicated. In many ways he was a great wartime leader, but the Indian famine is unforgivable. Story 54. Just name the people on Jeffrey Epstein's list, including the person in the White House whom an entire political party is protecting. Story 55. Joseph Mengele comes to mind. He lived out a cushy retirement in South America, hardly hiding his identity, and died in 1979. Story 56. Mengele, an absolute monster who masterminded the Nazi death camps. Story 57. Adolf Hitler started it all and committed suicide at the end. Story 58. Henry Kissinger encouraged many wars and war crimes carried out by the United States. He believed authoritarianism was acceptable as long as it was not Nazi or communist. Every president treated him as a guest of honor, including liberals. He did more damage to international peace than any other person. Known as the Beltway Butcher and America's most notorious war criminal, he died at the age of 100 at home. The first half of a podcast series lists his misdeeds. Story 59. Stalin. The Soviet Union helped the Allies defeat fascism, and we should remember that. We should also remember that it was a brutal regime that starved and killed many people. Story 60. Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, and Attila the Hun were each responsible for millions of deaths, then died of natural causes. They are still admired by many today. Story 61. Depends on your definition of get away. Stalin and Pol Pot both come to mind. Even Hirohito escaped prosecution because the United States wanted to use him in the occupation of Japan, despite the slaughter of millions of Chinese and many Allied soldiers. Hitler, though, was never brought to justice. He shot himself in a bunker instead of facing defeat and the consequences for being perhaps the most evil person this world has seen. He did lose his life, but I would argue he was never brought to justice as other Nazi war criminals were. The result would have been the same, but a public hearing presenting the facts and placing the responsibility squarely on him surely would have meant something to the world and to individuals, even if he had later been executed. What about the Trail of Tears and everyone involved in that? Quite frankly, many of them are regarded as American heroes, and Andrew Jackson in particular is still celebrated as a prominent president. Good job for trying to exterminate the people you stole a continent from. Here's a medal and the highest office in the land. I'm sure there are worse, but I think Stalin, Hitler, and Pol Pot would all definitely fall into that evil category. The others I mentioned are more of a gray area, but they still rub me the wrong way. Story 62. Stalin, the Holodomor, the Great Purge, the Doctor's Plot, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Story 63. Kim Il-sung was very bad. I do not know if he was the worst, but he is certainly among them. Also, Columbus essentially exterminated the Taino, and he has an entire holiday. Story 64. Look no further than Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Story 65. Robert Mugabe, the former dictator of Zimbabwe, died in a private hospital in Singapore while many of his people were too poor to afford medicine, let alone groceries. Before he gained power, Zimbabwe was known as the breadbasket of Africa because of its historical economic strength, but during Mugabe's 37-year rule, the country became one of the poorest in the world due to corruption and economic mismanagement. Mugabe's security forces brutalized civilians who opposed his government. He nationalized farmland, forcing white families who had run it for generations off their land. Many fled the country out of fear for their lives as the government attempted to redistribute land to the black majority. These farms had been privately owned and operated, and few people, including the government, knew how to run them. With no effective farm management, food became scarcer, worsening Zimbabwe's troubles. He was removed in a coup in 2017 but was never arrested and never faced significant consequences for his actions. Story 66. Mao Zedong. Roughly 30 million people died, with some estimates as high as 55 million, in the Great Leap Forward from starvation. During the Cultural Revolution, he promoted the systematic destruction of invaluable Chinese temples, monasteries, shrines, and classical texts. He kept a harem of teenage girls whom he routinely raped, some of whom were barely past puberty, and he continued this into his 80s. He is still revered in China today. Story 67. Georgia Tan dying of cancer before her child trafficking scheme was uncovered is definitely up there. Story 68. A man imprisoned his own daughter in the basement of their family home and raped her for decades. He impregnated her a couple of times. He spent time in prison but was released because of dementia. Lucky bastard. Story 69. I would say every single person who was a part of Jeffrey Epstein's entire operation. Story 70. Many people starved to death in India under a certain well-known and revered Western leader. Story 71. All of the genocidal maniacs mentioned above rank higher than some on my list, but they definitely deserve a mention in my opinion. Slobodan Milosevic, Theoneste Bagosora, Dick Cheney, George W. Bush, Lee Atwater, Andrew Jackson. Story 72. In terms of death toll, Mao is far ahead at 60 million peacetime deaths, mostly caused by famine resulting from government policy. He died in his bed. Story 73. Thomas Mitchell Jr. created leaded gasoline, which caused widespread lead poisoning, and chlorofluorocarbons, which created a hole in the ozone layer. Story 74. Emperor Hirohito is likely on that list, given Japan's actions in Asia during World War II. What he received was practically a slap on the wrist. His title became largely ceremonial and he was no longer presented as a divine being, yet he remained emperor until his natural death despite those actions. Story 75. I do not know if he was the single most evil person, but he allowed, arguably, the most despicable and cruel nation in history to commit brutal conquest, institutionalized rape, and mass murder. He continued to rule his nation for decades. Who am I talking about? Hirohito. Story 76. Menjul has been mentioned, but the Japanese equivalent of his evil was Shiro Ishii. He conducted experiments on women, children, and others they referred to as Maryuta, meaning logs, because their goal was to use as many test subjects as possible. They tested every disease, weapon, and method of torture on these people and documented it. The United States funded his research after World War II, and he was never held accountable. Nightmare fuel. Story 77. Gavrilo Princip's sandwich stop arguably set off the chain of events that led to both world wars. It was a pretty catastrophic lunch. Story 78. King Leopold II of Belgium, in his personal rule over the Congo Free State, was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 10 million people through horrific methods, including mutilation of hands for failing to meet rubber collection quotas. Story 79. Unit 731 largely got away with the horrific acts they committed. Story 80. Delphine Lalaurie was an infamous slave owner who tortured enslaved people in her mansion. The details are very violent. Look them up at your discretion. After she was exiled from New Orleans, she lived the rest of her life in Paris and is believed to have died at age 62. Story 81. I'd say Hitler, assuming he killed himself. That was an easy way out for someone responsible for so much pain and suffering. I hope there is justice in the afterlife. Story 82. Hitler took the easy way out and did not have to stand trial or face his crimes. Story 83. People who knew that these substances were very harmful to health and did not break down naturally decided to dump vast quantities of per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances into the environment. Story 84. I do not think any of the major criminals in history were punished. Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, and Genghis Khan all went scot-free. This world is an evil place that no one should have to experience. Story 85. Heinrich Himmler, a senior leader of the Third Reich, committed suicide as the regime collapsed and did not face trial. Story 86. Mao Zedong. Killing more people than anyone in history was not enough. He was also responsible for the destruction of numerous Chinese artifacts, cultural sites, records, and historical materials. The losses during the Cultural Revolution were unimaginable. Thousands of years' worth of rich history and culture went up in smoke because he wanted to hold on to power after causing millions to starve to death through sheer incompetence. He is still revered in China. His portrait even appears on Chinese currency. Story 87. Apart from the names mentioned, King Leopold II of Belgium was a cruel ruler who terrorized the Congo Free State as his private colony. Rubber demand grew with the rise of bicycles and cars, and Leopold's agents forced Congolese villagers to harvest rubber under brutal conditions. Failure to meet quotas often meant torture, mutilation, or death. Historians estimate that millions of Congolese people died under this system. Belgium took over the territory from Leopold in 1908, but the damage of his rule lingered for generations. Story 88. Joseph Ratzinger, who served as Pope Benedict XVI, has been accused of concealing decades of reports of transcontinental, systemic child abuse and rape, allegedly in the name of the greater good of the Church. Story 89. One person I never hear anyone talk about is Dr. Kellogg, the serial guy. He was no Hitler, but he was deeply disturbed. He was basically the main reason victim blaming exists to this day. The Zodiac Killer also comes to mind. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.